President Joe Biden has warned of a distinct possibility that Russia might invade Ukraine in the next month. Russia has meanwhile said it sees little ground for optimism in resolving the crisis after the U.S. rejected its main demands. The buildup of tens of thousands of Russian troops on the Ukraine's borders in recent weeks has stoked fears of an invasion. The U.S. president made the comments in a telephone conversation with the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky on Thursday. During their discussion, President Biden reaffirmed the readiness of the United States along with its allies to respond decisively if Russia further invades the Ukraine. President Zelensky has said they discussed recent diplomatic efforts on de-escalation and agreed on joint actions for the future. Another important phone call will take place on Friday when French President Emmanuel Macron speaks directly with Russia's Vladimir Putin. Peter Matthews is a professor of political science and international relations at Cypress College, California, in the United States. He joins us now to talk a little bit more about this. A very good evening to you. Thank you so much for speaking to us.
My pleasure. Thank you.
All right. So Russia says it will not start a war in the Ukraine, but it says at the same time, or rather warns that the U.S. and NATO have ignored its demands. So what does this effectively mean? Does it mean that there's little room left for compromise in the crisis?
There is little room left, but there is room left, and it's a matter of the attitudes of both sides and how this is resolved. This is a very, very critical crisis. This could erupt into a major conflagration in the Ukraine. The NATO could get involved, and it could explode into a global or a European theater of a war. And you know, 2 world wars started in Europe, one of them through miscalculation, World War I, and this has lent itself to miscalculation very easily. So we have to look to see what is Russia concerned about. They don't want NATO to be expanded any further because NATO was expanded in 1990 when German unification was on the table, and President H.W. Bush, as well as James Baker, the Secretary of State, agreed that they would not expand NATO beyond any one. And here's the words of Secretary of State Baker. He said, "Not 1 inch eastward will NATO be expanded." And yet a year or so later, when the Soviet Union disappeared, that was the beginning of when NATO started expanding and taking in Eastern European countries and taking in even former Soviet bloc countries, Soviet countries like Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. This is seen as a real threat to Russia by Putin. And in this case, he drew his line in the sand and said, no more expansion. He wants to get a guarantee from NATO and from Ukraine that Ukraine will not join NATO and that NATO will not continue expanding eastward. And yet the United States doesn't want Russia to invade and use and change borders through force or capture territory. And NATO, we don't want that from Russia either. So compromise has to be reached, but cool heads should prevail by listening to the other side, each other's side, and not just having only your point of view.
I'm curious about this, Professor Matthews. Russia is saying that the U.S. and NATO are not shifting on its main demands. And as you said, one of those key conditions is NATO expansion, stopping the deployment of alliance weapons near Russian borders and rolling back its forces from Eastern Europe. Can the U.S. really make an undertaking on the Ukraine's behalf, a sovereign nation, that it won't join NATO? And can NATO say no to the Ukraine if it wants to join it?
NATO can do this, in a sense, behind-the-scenes negotiation. They can assure Ukraine that they would make sure that Russia will not invade Ukraine. They'll be there for their assistance, but not formally have Ukraine join NATO. NATO does have a provision of open membership. That itself is problematic because look at the name of the association, of the military alliance. North Atlantic Treaty Organization was established to block possible Soviet aggression or expansion in Central Europe and Eastern Europe. This is a long ways from there. And so there has to be some way that NATO, the United States, as a leader of NATO, can work through with NATO to, behind the scenes, assure Ukraine of its security, territorial security, at the same time not formally allow Ukraine to join NATO and let that be negotiated behind the scenes so it doesn't become a flagrant point of contention. That's how it has to be done, in my view. And the U.S. has a very important role right now, and so does NATO and the other NATO members, to play in diffusing this crisis that could get completely out of hand at this point.
Just explain to us in a little bit more detail what it would mean for Russia in terms of security, in terms of influence. We've had the Belarusian president saying that there will be no war unless Belarus and Russia come under attack, and it's accused the West of trying to, quote, drown our Slavic brotherhood in blood.
Pretty violent words, or at least are very provocative words, but yet again, they're made in these crisis situations, that makes it even more dangerous. So what I would say is that if you go back to the history of what happened, Ukraine is this country that has two major ethnicities, Ukrainians and Russians. And, they're related in ancient times. I mean, Ukraine was a part of the Russian Empire for many, many, many centuries. It was part of the Soviet Union. And when the Soviets fell apart, Ukraine was one of the republics that actually split off in its independent position. But there's a lot of cultural ties, and about 20% of the Ukrainians are Russian-speaking. It's about 18% actually, Russian-speaking, Russian ethnicity, and they wanted to be treated equally and fairly in cultural areas, etc. And they claim discrimination. But don't forget that President Yanukovych, who was elected in 2010, democratically elected, he was leaning more toward Russia in his foreign policy. He refused to have the more integration with the European Union, which some of the Ukrainians wanted in Ukraine. But there are many Russian-speaking people who do not want that greater integration with the European Union. They want to be more integrated with Russia, economically, culturally, etc. And there was a split position that the people of the Ukraine have taken, the two different ethnicities, and that has to be resolved, and find a way to get them to stay together and to maybe have a federal system in Ukraine if they would agree to it. But don't have to go that far. The main thing is you have to accommodate the various ethnicities in Ukraine, especially the Russian minority. And this is a real big problem. Unless the Ukrainian government does that, there's going to be a lot of problems here. And don't forget, Yanukovych was overthrown by an uprising because he wanted to get Ukraine to be closer ties with Russia. And the large Ukrainian Ukrainian-speaking majority in Ukraine did not want that. And many of them rose up in the streets and overthrew the president. And unfortunately, there was some Western interference in that particular endeavor as well. There's evidence from the Cato Institute. A lot of documentation that has to be talked about in these interviews about what's going on today has to do with history.
So just lending on history, but also looking at the current situation, how would you characterize President Zelensky? He's been described by some as a Russian-friendly president. I mean, you take the situation where President Biden is saying, look, an attack is imminent, and President Zelensky has told the West to calm down. Either say it's because of financial markers, but he's just saying that he really doesn't believe that an attack from Russia is imminent. So because of this, should he be described as a Russian-friendly president, or is there anything borrowing from history or the current situation that would characterize him as such?
I don't think so, because I think he's a person who's a Ukrainian national, believes in Ukraine as his nation. He's proud of it. He wants to make sure at this point that there is no war. He doesn't want a battle between Russian troops and his forces. That, in fact, there's already been that conflict going on in eastern Ukraine already for many years, have resulted in thousands of deaths of Ukrainians and Russians. He doesn't want this to become a huge, overwhelming war where Russia attacks Ukraine, Ukraine has to fight back, NATO gets involved. And even the saber rattling on both sides is causing his economy to go down in the tank. So he's saying, let's keep calm heads, calm statements about this. Let's work through diplomacy. And don't say that war is inevitable, Mr. Biden. Please, President Biden, don't say it's inevitable. People have agency on both sides to avoid war. And I think President Zelensky really wants to avoid war and still be a secure nation in its own regard, have Ukraine be secure. That's a very fine balancing act. It can be done. It's going to take cool heads to prevail. I think Zelensky is taking more of a cool head approach at this point when he says, don't talk about war being imminent. Let's work through negotiation and diplomacy, as well as being firm that Ukraine must be kept and allowed to be independent and not threatened by Russia or Russian troops.
So Russia's foreign minister Lavrov says the U.S. had suggested that the two sides could talk about limits on the deployment of intermediate range missiles, restrictions on military drills, and rules to prevent accidents between warships and aircraft, some sort of a compromise. But he said that Russia proposed this issue years ago, but Washington and its allies never took them up on it. up until now. Your thoughts on this and how true is this?
It's fairly accurate, and I think that this has to be dealt with because those issues are very important issues, but they're considered to be somewhat secondary to the issue of whether or not Ukraine will join NATO. They're both important. The idea that Ukraine should somehow not join NATO, but also the other things, that these issues that you just brought up in this assessment, are really important. About, Russia feels threatened at times when there are American missiles in parts or bases right next door. And don't forget the 3 former Soviet republics, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, that were taken into NATO against any kind of assurance that not just President H.W. Bush and James Baker gave, but also the leaders of Germany, of Britain, and France. And many of them, there are memos and documented memos in the George Washington University National Archives today. It's been put on display that shows these leaders back in 1990 assured President Gorbachev of the Soviet Union, if he allows Germany to unite into one country, NATO would not be extended eastward. So this has to do with those 2 major issues. NATO membership of Ukraine, which is the #1 issue for Russia, and also these other kinds of redeployment. Not redeployment necessarily, but certainly moving back a bit from an aggressive posture that might seem to be aggressive to Russia, with American troops and forces right in some of those Eastern European nations. And actually hardware as well. You have military bases there too. And that's provocative from the point of view of Russia. You can imagine if Russia had military bases in Mexico or in Canada, that wouldn't be taken very well.
Minister Lavrov has also said the discussion between President Putin and Emmanuel Macron of France has been around these key demands and the lackluster manner in which the US and NATO have responded to these demands, which it sees Russia as critical to bring about some sort of rapprochement. How empathetic or sympathetic will France be to Russia on these demands, and what role can it play in, I know it's been encouraging more talking, but how influential will it be on how a peace can be brokered?
France has had a traditional historical involvement with diplomacy, for many decades and centuries. So it's in a good position now to serve as an honest broker between, the forces of NATO and also Russia, and to say it is time to show an enthusiasm for resolving this crisis. It's not just so much about attaining the agreement, but how you do it. Do you seem sincere about it? Those things are very important in diplomatic negotiations, and the Western side, the NATO side, has to show that to Russia, and Russia has to show also they're serious about forswearing any kind of attack on Ukraine or any country in the region. Any of the former Soviet republics cannot be taken back forcefully, and Russia has to show by not only troop movements, but also it's the way it states things, that they are very serious about de-escalating the situation and allowing security for all sides, real national security for all the sides.
So just a final question. The issue of sanctions keeps on coming up every now and then as a way of pushing Russia to the brink to reach some sort of an agreement. There's a view by some, though, that it may not have the desired effect. Europe has threatened sanctions like never seen before, but there are those who believe that over the past years, through its historical experience, Russia has learned to be more self-reliant from Europe, that any further sanctions won't necessarily impact on it as much as Europe or the allied countries would think. What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I believe that the sanctions are a tool that's been put forth in this diplomatic time when they're trying to make sure Russia takes it seriously. But on the other hand, Russia has $640 billion in reserves, foreign reserves. Russia has been getting itself to be more self-sufficient economically. It also holds an ace card where Russia produces natural gas for Europe. A lot of the countries in Europe and Eastern Europe get natural gas from Russia. If they cut off the pipeline or threaten to do that, that could devastate the European economies. At the same time that Germany is waiting for this Nord 2 stream of natural gas from Russia to Germany, and the NATO is trying to use that as a leverage against Russia. So you're looking at leverage from both sides and arguments that either side will be in a detriment if the other side acts. I think that this is a two-edged sword. That's the whole thing. So I wouldn't say that there is one more sanction, though, that could be very devastating to the Russian economy if it were brought forth, and that's the SWIFT the SWIFT program, which is the global banking system, which allows Russia to buy and sell its products, especially its natural resources such as natural gas and oil to the West. And if the SWIFT nations and the executive committee decides to withdraw or get Russia out of SWIFT, that could reduce the Russian economy by 5%. And that would be very devastating. But it would take a unanimous vote to get SWIFT to kick Russia out. And it would have to include representatives from the Eastern Bloc and even Russia, and to be able to do that with the SWIFT community. So this is the only one sanction that could have a major impact, I think, in this case. So we should really rely more on negotiations, on diplomacy, on the political, military side of it, as opposed to just thinking sanctions will work.
All right, thank you for your time and your insights. Peter Matthews is a professor of political science and international relations at Cypress College in California in the United States of America.